Have you ever wondered what life truly feels like after the final paycheck? When the alarm clock stops ringing and the world suddenly gets quiet? Henry Walker had. For 45 years, he worked as a financial advisor in Ohio, saving every penny, dreaming of peaceful retirement days filled with coffee, sunsets, and laughter. But as he sat alone on his porch one calm evening, staring at the empty rocking chair beside him, he realized retirement wasn't what he expected. The question that haunted him wasn't, do I have enough money? It was, did I live enough life? Tonight, Henry decided to tell the truth, the kind that only comes when the noise fades and time finally slows down. The night air felt heavier than usual, as if it carried the weight of unspoken words. Henry leaned back in his old rocking chair, the wood creaking softly beneath him, the same chair his wife, Linda, had gifted him on his 60th birthday. Back then, retirement had felt like freedom. He remembered the farewell party at his office, the laughter, the speeches, the gold watch they gave him with his name engraved on the back. Everyone said, "You earned your rest, Henry," but no one told him what to do with it. In the beginning, everything was fine. Long walks, endless cups of coffee, catching up with old friends. But slowly, one by one, those friends stopped calling. His days began to blur together like pages of a forgotten book. He had money, comfort, and time, but something was missing. Something he couldn't name. That night, he looked at the calendar on the wall. September 12th, the day Linda used to bake his favorite apple pie. She'd been gone for 5 years now. He took a deep breath, feeling that strange emptiness in his chest again. Retirement wasn't peaceful anymore. It was silent. Then his phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "Mr. Walker, I found something that belongs to you. Can we meet tomorrow?" He frowned, confused. Nothing in his life seemed worth finding anymore. But there was something in that message, a spark of curiosity, a whisper of purpose that made him say out loud, "All right then, let's see where this goes." The next morning, Henry woke up earlier than usual, something he hadn't done in years. The morning sun stretched across the quiet streets of Maple Creek, painting the town gold. As he brewed his coffee, he couldn't shake off that message from last night. Who could it be? What could they possibly have that belonged to him? He hadn't lost anything, or at least nothing material. Maybe it was a scam, he thought. But deep down, something told him it wasn't. There was a strange pull in his chest, a feeling he hadn't known since the days when life still surprised him. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. The message had no name, no picture, just a local number. Finally, he typed back, "Who is this?" Within seconds, a reply appeared. "Someone who remembers you, Mr. Walker. Can we meet at the old train station at 4 p.m.? Henry's mind started racing. The old train station? That place hadn't been used for years, not since the new one opened on the other side of town. Why there? He almost laughed at himself. "You're 72, Henry. What are you doing chasing mysterious messages?" But something about it, the timing, the tone, made him feel alive again. The day passed slowly. Every tick of the clock reminded him how empty his home had become. He looked around, framed photos, dusty books, memories frozen in time. He remembered how, right after retirement, he told himself he'd travel the country, see the mountains in Colorado, drive along Route 66, visit his college buddy in Florida, but he never did. Comfort became a cage, and fear whispered that he was too old to begin again. By 3:35, he put on his brown jacket, the one Linda always said made him look distinguished. He checked his reflection. Wrinkled face, silver hair, eyes still holding a flicker of youth. Then, with a sigh, he grabbed his keys and stepped outside. The drive to the train station took 15 minutes, but the memories it stirred made it feel longer. He remembered bringing Linda here once, long ago, when they'd just started dating. She used to love train rides, said they made her feel like life was moving somewhere. Now, as he parked beside the old platform, the place looked almost untouched by time. Weeds growing between tracks, faded signs, and that same wooden bench still sitting under the station clock. Henry looked around, waiting. The wind carried the faint sound of chimes from a nearby church. A few minutes later, he saw a figure approaching, a young woman, maybe in her late 20s, holding a small brown box. She smiled nervously as she came closer. "Mr. Walker?" she asked softly. "Yes," Henry replied, eyeing the box. "Do I know you?"
She hesitated. Not really, but I think you knew my father. He said you changed his life. Henry blinked, confused. Your father? Who was he? She opened the box and handed him an old photograph, a group picture from the 1980s, back when Henry worked at the firm. And there, among the faces, was a young man with a bright smile, one Henry hadn't thought about in decades. The woman said quietly, "He told me if anything ever happened to him, to find you. He said you were the man who showed him what truly mattered." Henry's heart started pounding. He couldn't remember the man's name, but the photo stirred something deep. A forgotten connection, maybe, buried under years of routine. For the first time in years, Henry felt his past calling him, not to haunt him, but to remind him that life, even after retirement, still had unfinished stories waiting to be told. Henry stared at the photograph, his hands trembling slightly. The edges were worn, the colors faded, yet there was something unmistakable in that smiling face. It took him a few moments before the name returned to him like a whisper from the past. Mark Evans. He had been one of my first clients, a nervous 20-something who'd walked into my office with barely a few $100s to his name and a dream of starting his own business. I'd seen something in him back then, something familiar, that same restless hunger for a better life. "You're Mark's daughter?" Henry asked, his voice barely steady. The woman nodded, clutching the box tightly. "Yes, my name's Emily. My dad always said you were the reason he didn't give up."
Henry's mind drifted back to the old office. The buzzing phones, the smell of fresh coffee, the sound of typewriters clicking away. He remembered how Mark would stay late, asking questions about savings, investments, life goals. He'd been so eager, so alive. And then, one day, he stopped coming. Henry assumed he'd moved on, like so many others did. Emily sighed. "My father passed away last year," she said softly. "He left me this box. He told me that when the time was right, I'd know who to give it to. And when I found your name written inside, I had to find you." Henry opened the box slowly. Inside was a folded letter, a key, and an old business card. His own, from decades ago. His heart felt heavier with every breath. The letter was written in careful handwriting. "Henry, if you're reading this, I guess time has caught up with both of us. You once told me something that stayed with me forever, that the real value of life isn't in what you earn, but in what you leave behind. You were right. Because of that lesson, I built something worth leaving, and now I'm leaving it for you to see." Henry looked up, his eyes glistening. "What did he mean by that?" he asked. Emily smiled faintly. "That's what the key's for. It's to his old workshop on Elm Street. He said there's something there you should see." For a long moment, Henry couldn't speak. His mind was spinning, not just with curiosity, but something deeper. A feeling he hadn't known in years. Purpose. It was as if life had suddenly offered him another chance to do something that mattered. He looked around the empty station, the quiet tracks, the fading sunlight, and thought about how retirement had turned his world small, predictable, colorless. But this was something new. A door opening where he thought there were none left. "Thank you, Emily," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to me." She smiled gently. "My dad said you'd say that." As she walked away, Henry sat back on the bench, holding the letter against his chest. For years, he'd believed that his best days were behind him. But tonight, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he felt something stir within. Not youth, not nostalgia, but the simple, powerful reminder that even after retirement, life could still surprise you. He whispered to himself, his voice breaking slightly. Maybe it's not too late to start living again. The next morning, Henry sat in his car outside the old workshop on Elm Street, the key from Emily turning warm in his palm. The place looked forgotten, a small red brick building with ivy crawling up its sides and a faded sign that read Evans Carpentry. The windows were dusty, the wooden door worn and weathered. It looked like time itself had stopped paying attention to this corner of the town. He hesitated before stepping out. There was something haunting about returning to a place connected to someone he hadn't seen in decades. Yet, somewhere deep inside, a small voice urged him forward. For years, his days had been defined by routine. The same breakfast, the same chair, the same quiet house echoing with memories. But this was something different. This was the kind of uncertainty he hadn't felt since his youth, the kind that made his heart beat a little faster. He inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, releasing a musty scent of old wood and oil. Dust particles floated in the sunlight that poured through the cracked window. The workshop was filled with unfinished furniture, tools neatly arranged and drawings pinned to the walls. On one of the tables lay a wooden box covered with a thin layer of dust and a note taped to it. Henry carefully unfolded the note. It read, "If you're reading this, Henry, it means you kept your promise, even if you don't remember making it. You told me once that life is built, not bought. Every plank, every nail, every choice. This workshop is proof of that. Look beneath the bench. There's one last project I never finished." Henry's throat tightened. He crouched and lifted the cloth beneath the old workbench. There, wrapped in burlap, was a wooden rocking chair, half carved, half polished, waiting for completion. He ran his hand across the smooth armrest, feeling the marks where Mark had stopped. It was almost poetic, unfinished, like so many parts of his own life. He sat down on the floor, the letter still in his hand, and stared at the chair. Memories of his own life flooded back. The early years when he and Linda had nothing but dreams, the long nights working to build a future, and the quiet evenings they'd spent in the backyard, her reading while he watched the stars. For years, he'd convinced himself that life had slowed because it was meant to, that growing old meant watching the world pass by. But now, sitting in that dusty workshop, surrounded by echoes of someone else's unfinished dreams, Henry felt something shift. He stood, brushing the dust from his sleeves. "All right, Mark," he whispered. "Let's finish what you started." The old man spent the rest of the afternoon working on the chair. The sound of the tools, the smell of fresh wood, it all brought back a sense of rhythm to his soul. By evening, as golden light streamed through the windows, Henry had done it. The chair stood complete, simple but beautiful, not perfect but real. He sat in it, closing his eyes. It creaked just like the one on his porch. But this time, the sound didn't echo loneliness. It echoed purpose. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered to himself, "Thank you, Mark. You gave me more than a project. You gave me back my reason to wake up." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and for the first time in years, Henry smiled softly. Not because the past had returned, but because the future suddenly felt possible again. The next few days passed differently. For the first time in years, Henry woke up with purpose. He would drive to the old workshop every morning, dust off the tools, open the windows, and let the sunlight flood in. There was something deeply comforting about the smell of sawdust, the hum of the small fan, and the rhythm of his hands working again. Retirement often felt like an ending, but now, standing there among unfinished dreams, it began to feel like a continuation. Every piece of wood in the workshop told a story. Mark had left notes pinned to the walls. Measurements, sketches, small reminders like, "Don't rush the edges, let the wood breathe." Henry began reading them aloud, as if Mark were still there beside him. It was strange. Two men, decades apart, connecting across time through grain and polish. Somewhere between sanding and shaping, Henry realized how much he'd missed creating. For years, he'd built numbers, not things, investments, not legacies. But here in this quiet workshop, he was building something real again. One afternoon, while sweeping the floor, he noticed a small wooden chest tucked behind a stack of planks. It was locked, but a small tag on it read, "For the next builder." He used the same key Emily had given him, and it fit. Inside were dozens of letters. Some were addressed to Mark's clients, some to friends, and a few were simply marked reflections. Henry sat down at the workbench and began reading them. The letters spoke of dreams postponed, of lessons learned too late, of people Mark had wished he had palled but never did. In one, he'd written, "The hardest part about growing old isn't losing your strength, it's losing the reason to use it." Henry froze. Those words cut through him like lightning. That's exactly how he'd felt for years. Capable, but aimless. He read another line. "If you ever feel like life has passed you by, build something. Anything. Because creation reminds us we still exist." Henry put the letter down and looked around the workshop. The light was fading, dust shimmered like gold in the beams of the setting sun.
His hands, rough and trembling, rested on the table, hands that once built wealth, now building meaning. He decided to take the rocking chair home. That evening, he placed it next to his own on the porch, one old, one new, side by side, as if generations were having a silent conversation. He sat between them, staring at the horizon where day melted into night. As the wind carried the scent of autumn leaves, he whispered to himself, "Maybe that's what life is. A series of unfinished chairs waiting for us to keep building." Tears welled in his eyes, but they weren't from sadness. They were from recognition that even in retirement, even in solitude, there are second chances to carve purpose from silence. The gold watch on his wrist glimmered faintly in the fading light, the same one he'd received on his last day of work. But now it no longer reminded him of time gone by. It reminded him of the time still left. Time to build, time to heal, time to live. That night, as the crickets sang and the stars blinked awake, Henry smiled softly. The world hadn't ended when his career did. It had just paused, waiting for him to find the courage to press play again. Retirement isn't the end of your story. It's the moment you finally get to write it your way.
A week later, Henry found himself back in the workshop, but this time not alone. Emily had come by, carrying 2 cups of coffee and that same warm, hesitant smile. "I thought you might need company," she said. Henry chuckled softly. "At my age, company's rarer than good weather," he replied. She laughed, and for a moment the silence between generations felt like it had melted away. Together, they looked around the workshop, the smell of sawdust, the sunlight slipping through the blinds, the faint hum of a world slowly coming back to life. "I didn't know he was this talented," Emily whispered, tracing her fingers across one of the old tables her father had made. "He never talked much about his work." Henry nodded. "That's what happens when people get older. We stop talking about what we love and start talking about what we've lost." Emily sat quietly, her eyes soft with thought. "Do you ever regret retiring?" she asked. Henry paused, the question hanging heavy in the air. "At first, I did," he said honestly. "Not because I missed the work, but because I didn't know who I was without it. You spend decades building a life around one thing, and when it's gone, it feels like the world stops needing you." Emily nodded slowly. "That's how my dad felt too. He used to say that when he stopped working, he felt invisible." Henry looked at her and smiled faintly. "Then maybe that's why he left this place behind. To remind someone like me that being seen isn't about having a title. It's about leaving something worth remembering." They spent the afternoon organizing the workshop, dusting shelves, sorting tools, uncovering more of Mark's projects. Every piece seemed to tell a story about patience, love, and time. Under one pile of wood, they found a small plaque Mark had carved. It read, "The hands that build heal the heart that's broken." Henry touched the words and whispered, "He was right." As the sun began to set, Emily looked at Henry with curiosity. "What will you do now?" He smiled, the lines on his face deepening with purpose. "I'm going to reopen this place. Maybe not as a business, but as a space for people like me, folks who've retired but still have something left to give. A workshop for second chances." Emily's eyes widened. "That's beautiful, Mr. Walker. My father would have loved that." Henry chuckled. "Then let's make sure his spirit stays alive here." They stood side by side, the old and the young, 2 generations bound by one man's unfinished dream. And as Henry locked up the workshop that evening, he felt a quiet peace settle in his chest, the kind that comes only when life starts to make sense again. He looked up at the fading sky and thought of Linda, of Mark, of all the moments he had once taken for granted. For the first time in years, he didn't dread tomorrow. He welcomed it. Driving home, he realized something profound. Retirement hadn't stolen his purpose. It had merely stripped away the noise, leaving him face to face with the truth. Life never stops giving you chances to begin again. It just waits for you to notice them. The real gift of retirement isn't rest. It's rediscovery.
It's the moment you stop chasing what the world expects and start listening to what your heart has quietly wanted all along. You don't stop living when you retire, you start remembering why you lived in the first place. A few weeks passed, and the old workshop on Elm Street began to change. The dust was gone, the shelves organized, and the faint scent of fresh paint filled the air. But the biggest change wasn't in the building, it was in Henry. The man who once sat quietly on his porch counting the days now moved with energy, purpose, and something close to joy. Word spread quickly around Maple Creek that the old Evans carpentry shop had reopened. But this time there were no sales signs or price lists, just a hand-painted board that read, Walker's Workshop, for anyone who still believes in starting again. It started with one visitor, an older man named Frank, who had lost his wife 2 years earlier. He came by one morning holding a small broken birdhouse. He said, "I heard you fix things." Henry smiled. "Only if you promise to help." They spent hours sanding, gluing, painting, and by the end, the birdhouse looked new again. But something deeper had been repaired that day. 2 hearts, both carrying the quiet ache of loneliness. Soon others followed, widows, retirees, even a few young people curious about the old man who still built furniture by hand. Each person brought something to fix, a table, a chair, a photo frame, but left with something much greater, connection. One afternoon, as the golden light poured through the windows, Henry stood watching a small group working together. Frank repairing a bench, Emily helping a teenager carve his first piece of wood. He leaned against the door frame, smiling softly. This was what he had been missing all along. Not the work itself, but the shared heartbeat of purpose. Yet that night, alone on his porch as the stars emerged one by one, Henry found himself whispering to the empty chair beside him, "Linda, you'd love what we've built here." He closed his eyes and imagined her laugh, the sound of it, the warmth. A tear slipped down his cheek, not from sadness, but gratitude. Because even though she was gone, her love still lived through the hands that shaped the hearts that healed. The workshop had become something larger than a place. It was a reminder that meaning doesn't fade with age, it just changes shape. Henry had found what most people search for their whole lives. Not wealth, not success, but the simple peace of knowing he still mattered. A week later, he stood outside the shop, watching as Frank and Emily hung a new sign above the door. Built by many hands, guided by one heart. He smiled, feeling the weight of 72 years rest lightly on his shoulders. Life hadn't ended when he retired. It had simply waited, patiently, for him to rediscover the rhythm he had lost. Retirement is not the end of usefulness. It's the beginning of purpose unchained from obligation. It's the chapter where you stop measuring your worth in hours worked and start counting it in lives touched. Life doesn't shrink with age, it deepens. The world still needs your hands, your stories, your wisdom. Don't fade quietly into the background. Paint your final years in bold, meaningful colors. Because sometimes the greatest legacy you'll ever leave isn't in what you built for yourself, but in what you helped others rebuild.
The first snowfall of winter arrived quietly, blanketing Maple Creek in a soft layer of white. The town looked still, peaceful, almost like it was holding its breath. Inside the workshop, the fireplace crackled while Henry sipped hot cocoa beside the rocking chair he had finished months ago. Around him, laughter filled the air, the sound of friends, both young and old, working together. What had once been a silent, forgotten space was now alive with conversation, sawdust, and stories. Henry watched from his corner as Emily painted ornaments with a little boy named Lucas, the grandson of Frank, who had started coming to the workshop every weekend. Lucas was only 9, but his small hands moved with the same focus Henry used to see in his younger self. "Good job, kid," Henry said with a smile. Lucas looked up and grinned. "Grandpa says you're the one who taught him how to build again."
That line hit Henry harder than he expected. It wasn't pride that filled him, but something gentler. A quiet realization that he had become part of other people's stories again. After retirement, he thought life had stopped needing him. But here he was, proof that purpose doesn't retire when you do. It just changes its form. Later that evening, after everyone had left, Henry stayed behind to close up. The fire had dimmed, the workshop silent again, but this silence was different now. It wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. As he turned off the lights, he noticed something new hanging on the wall. A framed photo of everyone who had come through the workshop over the past few months. Emily must have put it up without telling him. Beneath it, she had written in bold letters, "A family built, one piece at a time." Henry smiled, feeling his throat tighten. He sat in the chair by the window looking out at the falling snow and thought about how he almost missed all of this, how he almost spent his final years chasing comfort instead of connection. For decades, he had believed that retirement was the reward at the end of life's hard road. But now he knew better. It wasn't the end of the road at all. It was a crossroads, a chance to turn toward what truly mattered. He looked around the workshop one last time before heading out. The tools, the half-finished projects, and the lingering warmth in the air, and whispered softly, "Thank you, Mark, for finding me again when I didn't even know I was lost." As he stepped outside, snowflakes fell into his jacket, glimmering under the streetlight. Each one felt like a small reminder, fragile, fleeting, and beautiful. He realized that life was a lot like that, temporary but meaningful if you let it touch others before it melts away. Retirement is not about stepping back. It's about stepping closer to people, to purpose, to peace. It's not the fading of relevance. It's the awakening of presence. The world doesn't forget you when you stop working. It waits for you to show up in a different way. Because true fulfillment isn't in the years you've lived, but in the moments you finally begin to live them. And sometimes it takes reaching the quiet years to hear life whisper the loudest truth. You were never meant to stop, only to start again, differently and more meaningfully. The phone rang at exactly 7 a.m., sharp just like every morning before he retired. For a moment, Robert instinctively reached for his tie before realizing he didn't have to anymore. The tie, the rush, the meetings, they were all gone now. What replaced them was silence. Heavy, endless silence. The kind that doesn't fill the room, but your chest. Robert had been a bank manager for 40 years, respected, organized, and dependable. Every decision, every dollar, every day had meaning. But now, after retirement, the calendar on his wall was just blank. The first few weeks had felt like freedom. He'd sleep late, watch TV, and finally do nothing. But as the months passed, the silence turned from comforting to unbearable. One rainy afternoon, Robert went out for a walk, something he hadn't done in years. The streets were slick and quiet, and he found himself outside the old community center. Through the fogged glass windows, he saw a group of children laughing, painting messy strokes of color across long sheets of paper. One of them accidentally spilled paint on the floor and froze in panic. But before anyone could scold her, a woman in her 40s, maybe a teacher, just smiled and said, "Mistakes make masterpieces." That line struck him. Mistakes make masterpieces. Robert stood there for a moment, staring at the scene. Then he slowly pushed open the door. The teacher looked up, surprised. "Can I help you, sir?" He hesitated. "Actually, maybe I can help you." Over the next few weeks, Robert started volunteering there, helping with supplies, reading stories, fixing broken chairs. He didn't tell anyone who he was or what he'd done in life. He just showed up quietly, every morning at 9 a.m., the same way he used to show up at the bank. Except this time, it wasn't about money or meetings. It was about laughter, paint stains, and the joy of feeling needed again. One day, a little boy named Adam asked, "Mr. Robert, why do you come here every day if you don't get paid?" Robert smiled softly. Because some things, Adam, pay your heart instead of your wallet. That night, as Robert walked home in the golden light of sunset, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Retirement had once felt like an ending, but now he understood it differently. It wasn't about losing purpose. It was about redefining it. The life he thought was over had simply changed chapters. As he reached his doorstep, he looked up at the sky and whispered, "I thought I retired from life. Turns out, I just started living it." Retirement isn't the end of your usefulness. It's the rebirth of your meaning. For years, you worked for deadlines. Now, you can work for lifelines. The people, passions, and places that truly matter. Time doesn't take your value away. It gives you the space to rediscover it. The silence after retirement isn't emptiness. It's an invitation to fill it with new beginnings, unexpected joy, and the purpose you were too busy to notice before. As the sun sets on these stories of Henry, Mary, and Robert, one truth quietly stands above them all. Retirement isn't the end of the road, it's a bend in it. For years they believed life was about earning, achieving, and saving enough to finally rest. But when the noise of routine faded and the applause stopped, they discovered what most people never realize. Rest without reason feels empty. Henry found meaning in curiosity, chasing a mystery that reminded him that purpose doesn't retire. Mary rediscovered love and belonging, proving that age doesn't end connection, it deepens it. Robert, the man of structure, found beauty in chaos, laughter, and imperfection. Together, their stories whisper a gentle reminder. You can stop working, but you must never stop living. Retirement isn't a chapter of stillness. It's a canvas of second chances. It's where you learn that your worth isn't tied to your paycheck, but to the hearts you touch, the wisdom you share, and the peace you create. You don't retire from life, you retire into it. The world still needs your voice, your kindness, your courage. So when the alarm clock stops ringing, let your heart start speaking. Because the real measure of a life well lived isn't how much you earned, but how deeply you cared, how boldly you gave, and how beautifully you kept going. Even when the calendar said done. Retirement is not a closing door. It's the moment you finally walk through it, free, into everything you never had time to become.